Hey guys, we're going to be taking a look today at a couple of chapters, a couple of paragraphs from different chapters in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. So the first we're going to look at is from chapter 5. And if you're looking at the PDF I'm presenting to you right now, we're going to begin where it states, I look upon my departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation. So let's start there. I look upon my departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation as one of the most interesting events of my life. It is possible, and even quite probable, that but for the mere circumstance of being removed from that plantation to Baltimore, I should have today, instead of being here seated by my own table, in the enjoyment of freedom and the happiness of home, writing this narrative, been confined in the galling chains of slavery. Going to live at Baltimore laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all my subsequent prosperity. Okay, so again, he would have been confined to the galling chains of slavery. That means making him upset and angry because of something that's unfair, because of course slavery was definitely unfair, and it made him upset and angry. And going to live in Baltimore basically laid the foundation for what was going to happen afterwards, the prosperity, the good things that were going to happen to him afterwards. So basically his departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation is very interesting because it laid the foundation for him writing this narrative. Otherwise, he would have still been a slave. I have never regarded it as the first plain manifestation of that kind providence which has ever since attended me and marked my life with so many favors. I regarded the selection of myself as being somewhat remarkable. There were a number of slave children that might have been sent from the plantation to Baltimore. There were those younger, those older, and those of the same age. I was chosen from among them all, and was the first, last, and only choice. All right, so basically he's saying the providence which has ever since attended me, that's the belief in yourself that some people are going to control what happens in your lives and are going to be there to protect us. And so he felt that there was something out there that was kind of watching over him and making sure that he was going to be okay. And so he believes his move to Baltimore changed his life for the better. It brought him freedom, which then of course allowed him to be able to write this narrative. All right, let's go to chapter 7. We'll be starting with the paragraph that starts, my mistress was, so paragraph 2. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. Again, he's talking back to his mistress, one of his slave owners, Mrs. Auld, and how she was looking at him as being property, but being a slave owner was just as harmful to her as it was to Frederick Douglass. When I went there, she was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of those heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he had commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. Again, this is kind of reviewing what we talked about the other day with Mrs. Auld. She was kind and giving and warm before she owned slaves, and after owning slaves, she became hardened and angry. And again, her husband had told her she could no longer instruct him and teach him how to read. And we read that the other day. From this time, I was most narrowly watched. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. So basically, Mr. and Mrs. Auld were watching him to make sure he was not trying to learn to read, even though he was trying to do it himself. And Mrs. Auld taught him the alphabet when she first started to teach him. And so that made him want to learn how to read even more. So he's basically saying, she gave me the inch, she gave me the idea to start to learn to read, and I continue to do so afterwards, even though they did not want me to. The plan which I adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent of errands, I always took my book with me, and by going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used also to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. Okay, so basically he's saying anytime he went out to do an errand, he would bring bread with him and bring his book with him, and he would exchange that bread to the poor white children in the neighborhood for reading lessons. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who in return would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. I am strongly tempted to give the names of 2 or 3 of those little boys as a testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear them, but prudence forbids. Not that it would injure me, but it might embarrass them, for it is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. It is enough to say of the dear little fellows that they lived on Philpott Street, very near Durgan and Bailey shipyard. I used to talk this matter of slavery over with them. I would sometimes say to them, I wish I could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. All right, so he's talking about these little urchins, meaning a poor, dirty child, and he's saying that his knowledge he learned was useful. That was the valuable bread of knowledge. He was getting the useful knowledge while they were getting the bread to eat. And then he kind of said he'd like to give thanks to those boys for helping him, but he didn't want to get them into trouble for doing so or embarrass them because, of course, you're not supposed to teach a slave to learn to read and write. So he just kind of gave an idea about where they were located on Philpott Street near the shipyards. Kind of, again, to give a shout out to them in his book to say, thanks for helping me to learn to read, but I'm not going to name you by name. You will be free as soon as you are 21, but I am a slave for life. Have not I as good a right to be free as you have? These words used to trouble them. They would express for me the liveliest sympathy and console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. All right, so basically he would talk to those boys and tell them, when you're 21 years old, you're going to be an adult, you can do what you want. I'm going to be a slave for life. Don't I have the right to be free like you guys do as well? And that troubled those boys as they thought about that. So he would talk about the boys when he would go there for those reading lessons. So he'd take his book with him when he went on his errands, so he'd have time for lessons, and he would bring bread with him to give to those poor white boys in exchange for reading lessons. All right, this next part's going to start in page 35 here, partway down, where it starts with the more I read. So it's a little bit further down into the paragraph. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest as well as the most wicked of men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come, to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. All right, so he basically saying here that Mr. Auld had said that if you taught a slave to read, it was going to be bad for them. And he's seeing why that is, because now that he sees all the terrible things that happen to slaves, he realizes that being a slave is terrible. And he's learned that more as he's learned to read. And that's exactly what Mr. Auld said would happen to him. So Frederick's saying, as much as he's loved to learn how to read, it also is kind of a curse, because it's really teaching him what he's missed out on and what he's missing out on as a slave. So it says, it had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. Basically saying, learning to read showed Douglas how awful slavery was, but did not solve his problem of being enslaved. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by every object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate. The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared, to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound, and seen in everything. So how did learning how to read affect Douglas's view on being enslaved? Basically, it made him hate his slave masters and hate slavery even more. He could not stop thinking about it at all. It was ever present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it, and felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled in every calm, breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm. I often found myself regretting my own existence and wishing myself dead. But for the hope of being free, I have no doubt but that I should have killed myself, or done something for which I should have been killed. While in this state of mind, I was eager to hear anyone speak of slavery. I was a ready listener. Every little while, I could hear something about the abolitionists. It was some time before I found what that word meant. It was always used in such connections as to make it an interesting word to me. If a slave ran away and succeeded in getting clear, or if a slave killed his master, set fire to a barn, or did anything very wrong in the mind of a slaveholder, it was spoken of as the fruit of abolition. Hearing this word in this connection very often, I set about learning what it meant. The dictionary afforded me little or no help. I found it was the act of abolishing, but then I did not know what it was to be abolished. And obviously we know that abolition is the banning of slavery. So why was Douglas so interested in figuring out what abolition meant? Because he heard it so many times and knew it was related to slaves getting their freedom. So he's committed to being a reader, committed to ending slavery, and so anything connected to those two topics would be of interest to him. So he was wanting to know what abolition meant because he knew it had something to do with slavery. Here I was perplexed. I did not dare to ask anyone about its meaning, for I was satisfied there was something they wanted me to know very little about. After a patient waiting, I got one of our city papers containing an account of the number of petitions from the North, praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and of the slave trade between the states. From this time I understood the words abolition and abolitionist, and always drew near when that word was spoken, expecting to hear something of importance to myself and fellow slaves. The light broke in upon me by degrees. So basically, after Douglas figured out what abolition meant, he says, the light broken upon me by degrees. What does that mean? And how does this show the importance of this moment in his life? It's actually using a metaphor simile to talk about it. And he's saying basically the light opened up inside of him. He saw the meaning of abolition and the meaning of slavery and getting rid of slavery. And he wanted to go ahead and do whatever he could to help in that cause. So when he finally learned about what it meant, it opened his eyes and opened up his mind to doing his best to get rid of slavery. All right, guys, here's another glimpse into Frederick Douglass's narrative. Again, some big words that are used and lots of figurative language used to help to give his story. So that's why we read this together and go over it together. Have a great day, guys. I'll see you soon.